Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Open Infrastructure panel as part of Open Access Week 2020. My name is Caitlin Thaney. I'm the Executive Director of Invest in Open Infrastructure, a nonprofit that works on improving funding and resourcing for the open technology that research relies on. We have a stellar group with us today, and our thanks also to EBSCO for sponsoring this forum. This is the second of their event series this week for Open Access Week. EBSCO, as many of you know, is a big participant and also investor and supporter of open source and support for libraries, both academic, public, and beyond, and wanted to participate in these conversations as key supporters of open infrastructure. We are here today for the next hour to hear some perspectives from some top leaders in the sector who represent key projects, efforts, and experiences in building towards a shared, interoperable, and accessible system of research. Open infrastructure has gained a lot of attention in recent months, especially as we watch the global economy shift and demand on access to research and scholarship increase in response to the pandemic. We've also seen big shifts in open access with the cancellation of big deals, Plan S, transformative agreements, and more. As those shifts have taken place, one cannot ignore the relationship of open access to the underlying technology and systems, open infrastructure as we know it, that make that content and data available for research. This week's theme, or for this year's Open Access Week 2020, is around taking action to build structural equity and inclusion. And that's a topic that I'm looking forward to hearing the thoughts of the three panelists we have here today about. As we kind of move into this discussion, we'll hear some quick remarks from our panelists sharing out their experiences and perspectives on the topics of open infrastructure, how that relates to open access and some of the themes today and how their current work is reflected there. We'll then move into question and answer. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat. We have some colleagues who will be monitoring those questions and we'll be working to incorporate those over the course of the time. Also, this webinar is recorded and the recording will be made available via YouTube following this event. Okay, on to our panelists. We are thrilled to be joined by Tom Kramer, who is a Chief Technology Strategist and Associate University Librarian for the Stanford University Libraries, where he directs the technical development and delivery of Stanford's digital library services, including digitization, management, preservation, and access of digital resources that support teaching, learning, and research. He's the founder of the International Image Interoperability Framework, also known as IIIF, and a leader in numerous open source projects, including the Hydra project, which is now known as Samvera, Blacklight, and the Fedora repository. He's served on the board of directors or steering committees for the Open Library Foundation, DuraSpace, Preservation and Archiving Special Interest Group, Open Repositories, and the International Internet Preservation Consortium, IIPC. Anna Vauwick from Gdansk University of Technology. She is the director of their university library. She's also a member of the International Association of University Libraries Board of Directors and the Secretary General of IATUL. She's a member of the Spark Europe Board of Directors, and since December 2019 is also a national chapter of Data Stewardship Competence Center's implementation network within the Go Fair initiative. She's a coordinator of the Bridge of Data project implemented by the Gdansk University of Technology to build a data repository and data management service, as well as project manager in several other open science projects. Anna is an expert in the field of open science to scientific resources, digital libraries, as well as the organization and management of a scientific library. A graduate of the University of Wrocław, where she obtained a PhD in the field of library and information science. And in the years 2007 to 2016, she worked at the Wrocław University of Technology. And last but not least, we are joined by Simeon Warner, the Associate University Librarian and Director of IT at Cornell University Library. Simeon has particular interest in interoperability between library systems and the development of standards and collaborations to facilitate that. His current work includes digital preservation, OCCFL, which I'll let him tell you a little bit more about, the use of linked open data for description of library resources, LD4L and LD4P, image and AV interoperability through IIIF, and repositories for open access scholarly publishing, including work with Zamvera and ORCID. Past projects include technical direction of the archive ePrint archive and development of the OAI, PMH, and resourcing standards. So with that, I will hand it over to Tom Kramer to share his opening remarks.
Good morning or good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with such distinguished speakers and also addressing this topic. I think we all recognize the importance of open access, and not only from a scholarly and research standpoint, but from an ethical and moral one as we look at democratic distribution of information and enabling people to do research wherever they are in the world. And of course, open access requires tools, systems, people, and infrastructure to actually work. So what are some of the key, I'm looking forward to talking about what are some of the key drivers and some of the key success factors for enabling that. I do have a couple of thoughts or observations from having worked on this at Stanford University for the last 15 to 20 years. And I have been involved, as several of the panelists have been, in building open source software communities and also repository systems. And it's clear to me after that time that there is going to be no single repository or no single repository environment that is going to hold all of the content. And it's absolutely essential that as a community, we begin to focus increasingly on interoperability and standards of exchange, less on the software itself and more how we connect with other people. I think one other observation is that it's not just about the content, it's also about the services that surround the content and the entire research process, research lifecycle. So that would include, not just the articles, but also the data, but also the software, but also the information about the research that's conducted. And so the emerging fields of research intelligence or research information management are just as much about open access and just as critical to open access as open repositories might be. And then finally, for knitting all of this together, money is a really interesting calculus and way to measure people's incentives to cooperate or to play. And when you're moving into an open field, that becomes a little bit less direct, a little bit more indirect. And it's really essential that we collectively understand what are the motivations, not only of organizations from an economic or financial standpoint, but of individuals, and what do they get and benefit from by participating in these open environments. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Anna, over to you.
Hello, everyone. It is great to be here with you, with all the great speakers, and with our attendants. Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Caitlin. And what is my background? So I have been associated with the scientific libraries for several years. And my main professional and scientific interests turn around the roles of the academic libraries and librarians, which currently are changing as a result of the development of technology and the needs of the scientific community. And several years ago, I focused my doctoral dissertation on the importance of open access for the information activity of libraries. And today I'm heavily involved in the open research data movement and also participate in many openness projects and initiatives, such as Spark Europe, Gopher, or the EBSCO. As has already been said, I'm the director of the Gdańsk University of Technology Library, and the GUT is one of the best universities in Poland, conducting significant scientific research. And the library tries to serve the scientific community both in conducting research and sharing the results of the research conducted at the university. So for this purpose, we developed the Bridge of Knowledge repository, which collects all the information about the academic achievements of the university, including full text of publications, but also information about the research laboratory, scientific equipment, patents, etc. And since 2018, we have been developing a repository for sharing research data. And this is done as a part of the Bridge of Data project, co-founded by the EU funds. And the project is developed thanks to the cooperation of 3 Pomeranian universities, the GUT, the Gdańsk Medical University, and the University of Gdańsk, which is more general. And thanks to the collaboration of librarians who design technological solutions and services for scientists, the IT team that creates a repository that meets all the functional and technical requirements, and a team of scientists. Over 60 scientists from all 3 universities representing various scientific disciplines not only share their research data in the repository, but also allow us to understand their needs and design tailor-made services. And for many years, there has been a discussion about openness, motivated by the fact that scientific research is financed mostly from public funds. But openness, in my opinion, also accelerates the development of science, allows us to rely on the experience of others, not only on successes, but also on failures. And the open infrastructure also allows the sharing of resources that would be difficult to create by any individual university or research center, and would consume a huge financial resource. So, thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Lots to follow up on when we move to our question and answer. Simeon, I'd be curious about your perspectives. If you could tell us a little bit more about your background in this space.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Caitlin, for that introduction, and thank you, Tom and Anna, for your thoughts. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak as part of this panel on Open Access Week. My entree to open was a little over 20 years ago at the start of, I think, what we might call the open access movement now. I still very firmly believe that open access is the best way for the research community to do science and pursue scholarship. I further believe that open electronic access to both research and cultural heritage is valuable to our society beyond academia. I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes talking about ORCID, which I think is an interesting study in infrastructure. So ORCID set out to provide unambiguous and persistent identifiers for researchers and contributors in academic and scholarly domains. ORCID Inc. is a nonprofit, now 10 years old, with almost 10 million active author records. And looking back, as I was last night in preparing this, I thought, what are the sort of pivotal moments? And one of those was the creation of a set of 10 principles to guide the organization. Those are still to be found on the website. And I note that they include commitments to openness in participation, open availability of the data, open sourcing any code produced in creating ORCID, and a preference for using open source too. Of course, to be sustainable, somebody has to pay the bills. So this commitment to openness also had provision to charge for certain features around ORCID to ensure sustainability. ORCID itself is an interesting sort of infrastructure. It's an infrastructure that's most successful if there is just one system. It's most successful if everyone uses an ORCID ID rather than some researchers having a thingy ID or a widget ID. In many cases, centralization is convenient, but in the case of ORCID, I think the benefit of a centralized system is very high. That brings with it a great burden of responsibility. It brings with it a burden to control the scope and size of ORCID so it is sustainable. It brings with it the burden to avoid competing with other user communities. And I think a key to ORCID's success is understanding the need to be of value to all segments of the scholarly community that use it. Researchers and scholars, most importantly, must see benefit and be okay sharing their data. So even before we had legal rights to be forgotten in various domains, ORCID allowed researchers to delete their records, something we really want to create a lot of incentives so that people don't do, but that's necessary to ensure participation. And then there's research institutions, funders, and publishers who all need to see value to them in the ecosystem, and hopefully some portion of them sufficient incentive to help pay to sustain the infrastructure. As an infrastructure that relies extremely heavily on network effects to deliver value, the startup problem is also hard. So ORCID has relied upon loans, grants, and early members seeing the vision of success to get over that hump to a point where I'm pleased to say ORCID is now in a position of sustainability. Just to speak for a moment to the sort of theme of this year's Open Access Week, taking action to build structural equality and inclusion. Obviously, the purpose of infrastructures has a lot to do with that, but I think there are obviously technical aspects to that, but there's a lot about how one builds community, and I hope we'll get into some of those things as we go through the questions, but perhaps I'll wrap up now. Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you, Simeon. I mean, that's a great segue just to pick up on that thread about building communities. And I will just note that, you know, this is the third year running that the theme for Open Access Week has been anchored in equity and inclusion and building those practices into the systems. And I think when we talk about access, you know, open for whom often comes to light, especially as we talk about not only some of the inequities that exist in, you know, not only higher ed and in academia, that exist in open technology, both within academia and outside, and then also just the sheer challenges when we start speaking about this beyond a specific local context or even regional context. And so, Simeon, I would love for just to kind of pick up on your last comment, what you see as potential ways forward as we start talking about infrastructure and equity and inclusion and baking that more into the design of our systems.
So I think one of the aspects is that many or most open infrastructures rely on a community of contributors. And there's a sense in which the set of contributors and the inclusion of those contributors is very important to the outcomes of the infrastructure. So one needs to think about community structure and governance that supports inclusion within the community of practitioners. I think that means not just creating a welcoming and supportive environment, you know, that values things beyond just the code contributions to, you know, what does training, documentation, specification mean? It also means things like providing abilities to contribute at different levels. I think projects in the past sometimes have required someone to dig in at an extremely deep level to make any useful contribution, whereas it's very important to provide ways to contribute in smaller ways, and that provides a more inclusive environment. Perhaps I can let other people follow on now.
Great. Yeah. Tom.
Yeah, I'll follow up on that. That's a great cue. I think Simeon has really talked about it. I think that the ability to be inclusive and to enroll people in participating is very important for sustainability over the long term. I think we're all familiar with projects where there's a heroic contributor or small set of contributors or a single institution that kind of carries the weight. Over time and over the long haul, which is what I think many libraries and many researchers are really interested in, those things always tend to fade away. So designing for renewal and sustaining structures is really important. One part to build on what Simeon said is I think designing your project to be open from the start really makes a big difference. If you conceive of yourself from the beginning as something that many people could participate in, not only benefit from, but have a hand in, it can really affect how you structure things from the beginning in terms of having open code repositories or open documents and open minutes and open meetings from the very beginning. Yeah, so I think those are absolutely essential elements to think about, both scale and sustainability.
Yes, I totally agree with Tom and Simeon. What I like to point that the collaboration between the librarians and the IT staff and the service providers is very important because it allows us to save money and time of all of us and to provide services that are tailor-made. Thank you.
Anna, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that, actually. I know that as we talk and then the work that we're doing at, Invest in Open Infrastructure and looking at the sustainability of these systems, especially within universities and institutions, recognizing the complexity that exists of most of these services, not just existing solely within a library, but also touching IT disciplines, other departments, other collaborations, or even outside of that institution, other, sister libraries and a broader network. Can you speak a little bit more as to what you have found necessary to make those collaborations across such a diverse set of folks really successful? Like where have there been some challenges, maybe some advice for others who might be tuning in here, and Tom and Simeon, I would also love your perspectives on this afterwards as well.
Yeah, nowadays, for libraries nowadays, the decision to invest money in a solution is usually associated with resignation from another cost. So it must be always a well thought out decision and supported by a detailed analysis. And what is the most important part of making this decision is to be sure that the services are as I said before, tailor-made for our scientists, for the libraries that are providing different kind of services. And for example, in our institution, we are designing the repository together with the IT staff, and it is a homemade solution. But when we speak with other service or infrastructure providers, it is the most important part of the discussion is to be sure that they can achieve all our needs, and we don't have to, buy another solution to be compliant, to provide another functionality that is not in this solution that was provided before, and the interoperability with other solutions that are already used by our library or our university.
Thank you. Tom, Simeon, do either of you want to chime in? I know, Simeon, you had mentioned the principles in terms of what ORCID puts forward for, what they prioritize and how to best work in this space. Did you want to contribute any thoughts?
I was actually thinking more along the lines of the library as organization perspective, as consumer consumer and participant in communities. And certainly, as Anna was speaking, it resonated to hear this notion of you can't just keep adding things. At some point it becomes one in, one out, or if we can even do 2 out, 1 in, that would be more maintainable. I think the period of expansion of ever more services is certainly, from my perspective, over. So we need to think about, if we're adding something new, developing a new infrastructure, what is that replacing? Does it have sensible boundaries? Does it avoid duplication? Does it interoperate with other components that we want to support and evolve independently?
One of the key things I think we're looking at, especially as open science becomes the norm and is requiring new structures within our institutions and our research universities, is really breaking down some of the cylinders of excellence that have grown up in sort of the 19th or 20th century model of how a university works. I'm part of the steering group for an effort called APARD, or Accelerating Public Access to Research Data, in the United States. And this is being spearheaded by the American Association of Universities and the Association of Public Land-Grant Universities, so the AAU and APLU. And they're trying to figure out how can universities best react to and position themselves to the Holdren memo, which came out of the Office of Science Technology Policy in 2006 or 7, or 14 or 15. Sorry, the years blur together. The number one finding from that group so far has been that everyone cares about open access, open science, public access to data, research data publicly funded from grants, but it's no one's top priority. And it really requires a novel fusion of people from the Dean of Research or the Vice Provost of Research, the IT apparatus at the university, librarians, even security and privacy officers, to figure out how they can work together to really curate, preserve, and make accessible this data for reuse. So the first recommendation, and the most important one, is to actually get a group in hand that can solve this, because right now it's not in any individual organization or person's remit. There's no one thinking about this for 30 or 40 hours a week at most of our institutions. So I think that's going to be one of the big enablers and the big steps forward as we collectively look to advance in this space.
No, it's really fascinating, and I completely understand those challenges, especially when it comes to the priorities and weighing those priorities within institutions themselves, and outlining how to get towards that different state. Shifting from alignment on recognizing where you need to be to really operationalizing that as well. I know we had one question that came through in the chat, and please feel free for those that are tuning in to ask those questions, and we'll be sure to try to answer as many of them as we can in the remaining 30 minutes here. So one of the questions for the panel was about what challenges do we see around the discovery of research, and how can an open infrastructure facilitate better discovery? Does anyone want to jump in on that? Tom's nodding.
Waiting to hear what Simeon says. He's very good at this.
Simeon, do you want to start?
I could say that that the discovery of research was really how I got started in this space with development of OAI PMH, and in a way I feel we should have moved beyond that, but it's still a useful piece of infrastructure. I think one of the things that has really changed is that back 20 years ago, the crusade was at least share your metadata, please. Whereas people, I think, have at least now got over the idea that, yeah, that's helpful and we should all do that. And that's very widely believed. But I think, as we move forward, the challenges are, well, okay, we don't want to just share the metadata. We actually want to have automatic access to full content so that we can have systems that help mine and understand that and present it in different ways. And there are still challenges around the practicality of that, and around, concerns about appropriate reuse and licensing being applied. So still an active area, I think.
And Simeon, for those who might not necessarily be familiar as much with the acronyms, the OAI PMH, like a one-line description.
Yes, OAI PMH, the Open Archives Initiative Protocol for Metadata Harvesting, a relatively straightforward way to allow metadata to be copied from one system to another and kept up to date. And in particular, it was designed to be easy for the burgeoning repository community to implement widely.
Great. Before handing it over to Tom, just to build on that, and this is something that we often see in terms of discussions around open infrastructure, recognizing what sort of core components we are all sort of advocating for, about degrees of openness, the exchange of information, APIs, standards. I'd be curious this group's input. When we start talking about interoperability and standards and the exchange of information, we've seen a sort of different sense of how folks are approaching that, especially in these last few months, in recognizing the actual demand and urgency around that. Especially as the sustainability of certain services has come into question, but how someone can get their content in and out of a system, or be able to have it speak to another system to help meet current needs for research. I'd love this group's perspective as to where you might have seen some shifts in terms of the understanding, or at least the conversations around interoperability and the application of standards in your work.
I can maybe jump in on a point that addresses both what Simeon was talking to and Caitlin, your extension. One of the ways I think that's really one of the ways to advance discovery is really focusing on identifiers and persistent identifiers. I have been working in linked data not as long as Simeon, but long enough not to be a zealot. I think there are lots of practical limitations to linked data. But at the same time, really having strong identifiers like ORCIDs, like DOIs, like identifiers for your instruments or even institutions is one of the ways that we're going to see much better discovery of not only research and data, but the components that go into it. And one of the problems that we have right now is that we're trying to graft entities on or identify entities and graft them into metadata or full text articles or data after the fact. And that's backwards, is we should be minting them first and then referencing and then using them all the way from the research process itself through the publication, through preservation. So that does help, gives this really well-structured field where you can find certain things and then you can walk a graph to find related things. So this researcher worked with these other researchers, or they use these types of instruments, or we're working with these types of materials and they have these types of findings in these articles. It's really quite a powerful notion, and I think we're getting there. Through places or through initiatives like ORCIDs and DOIs, I think that's becoming more and more normative, but there's a lot more work to do. In most of our institutions, it's an add-on rather than kind of something that's baked in at the core. The other thing, really getting back to something that Anna said much earlier, is figuring out the cooperation across the university or across the research landscape and how different groups can work with each other. Really is around interoperability, and that's not trying to do everything in your own system, and realizing what other systems and groups provide and what that exchange should look like. And that's one of the best pathways to services being perhaps shut down. It's I think arguably better to have lots of smaller systems that knit together and where things can break off and new things can join, rather than very, very big things that are quote unquote too big to fail.
Thanks, Tom. Anna, just as a quick question, I would be curious to know, in terms of discoverability, I know that your current work is around bringing together these different institutes and these 60 scientists and quite a diversity of information. What does discoverability look like for you in that work? And what sort of challenges or opportunities have you sort of encountered through setting up that work?
Yeah, so the most important issue in that kind of team is communication, and using the same standards as Simon and Tom mentioned, because what is very important, and Tom mentioned just a second before, that interoperability is one of the conditions of FAIR principles, and we also encourage our scientists to look at the FAIR principles, at all the standards provided by not only by our repository but also by other repositories, the discipline repositories and general as well. And what is important, that is we need to join. We need to give a joint effort to discover the standards and discover the tools that are good for all our researchers and all the team, and that are provided by our tools that we are supporting.
Thank you, Anna. Simeon, I saw you unmute right before we went to Anna. Would you like to chime in?
Yeah, I really want to sort of pile on to what Tom said in a way, that when we started ORCID, we used to talk about author-disambiguation, and at some point I stopped.
It's funny
literally
stopped. As he said, at some point I stopped.
Simeon was having some connectivity issues before, so please bear with us. We'll see. Simeon, you dropped out for a moment, ironically, right when you said stopped. Would you like to repeat that sentence?
Okay, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Stop talking about disambiguation, and I now talk about the avoidance of ambiguity. Why put it in the first place? We know what John Smith wrote that article when they wrote it. The fact that we recorded it only as the string John Smith is the throwing away of information. If we record it with the identity of John Smith, we never lost it. So I think the creation of identifiers as necessary, but then the use of identifiers for entities is so important in making a more efficient and more discoverable ecosystem of information.
So building on that, we have a question from the audience about what are some good examples of interoperable solutions or workflows that you believe are most important to consider? I'll give you a moment to think, and whoever unmutes chimes in. I can see those wheels turning. Go ahead, Tom.
Well, I'm gonna, this is maybe not a complete workflow, but I'll jump in with IIIF as a potential example here. And for those of you who aren't familiar with IIIF, it's the International Image Interoperability Framework. And it emerged from a set of discussions where lots of individual digital repositories had really high resolution images of cultural heritage or research materials. And everyone had built their own custom-made applications and repositories, and none of the systems were interoperable. And a group of institutions got together and said, we're all trying to solve the same problems. We've all solved it differently. Why don't we just agree on how we should solve this moving forward? And this all really emerged in 2012. Now there are hundreds of institutions across the world who have used IIIF. It's really provided this normalizing layer of how you access image-based digital resources, how you can annotate them, how you link to the description. And the great thing about it is it's really removed image delivery as a concern from lots of people. They say, well, I've got this workflow. How do I get the data out? I'm just going to use IIIF because it opens up to tons of software providers, tons of consumer applications. Lots of people know how to use it. And it's really just smoothed everything out from scientific imaging workflows to conservation in museums when they're doing x-rays of materials, cultural heritage. So I've been surprised. I've been at digital preservation conferences and they've talked about IIIF as a key preservation strategy. And I said, well, it's all about access. And then they say, yeah, but it removes, you don't have to worry about how you recorded the image and how you're delivering it because it'll be stable over time. It's interoperable across time. And I said, this is right. This is a great topic for a digital preservation conference. So it's an example of just kind of a basal technology or a basal approach that applies across lots and lots of different silos and concerns.
And Tom, just as a quick question for those that might be less familiar with IIIF, what existed prior to that was doing at least part of that job? Was there anything that kind of evolved from? I'd be curious to know.
There were lots of high resolution, there were lots of image file formats and image delivery servers and clients, but it was a many to many, or each, there were so many standards to pick. It was wonderful. You could pick whichever one you wanted, but they weren't necessarily working with each other. I know like in microscopy, from talking to experts in that field, there's something like 105 different file formats because there's 105 different manufacturers of equipment, and each one has come up with their own standard. So there's at least 105 different systems for accessing that.
Thank you. Simeon or Anna?
Oh, go on, Anna.
Okay. So maybe it's not a ready solution, but what is worth to mention that Europe is developing European Open Science Cloud, and it should be a solution very interoperable for the whole university, all universities and all the European countries. And the interoperability of services that want to be a part of this European Open Science Cloud is a key to the success. The idea of the Open Science Cloud, European Open Science Cloud, is the joint infrastructure and joint services for open science, for open research data, and a lot of people from different countries and from different background, IT staff and researchers and librarians are involved. And we will see how it will work because it is still under development. But I think this EOSC initiative is worth to mention.
Thank you, Anna. And I know that it's an immense amount of work to build that up, and it's been a multi-year effort as well. Simeon, good examples of interoperable solutions or workflows. I know you've got plenty that you're directly involved and you could choose from.
Well, certainly the ideas from IIIF that Tom described are particularly applicable here, but just going back to ORCID for a moment, one of the ideas of sets of identifiers in different systems that are themselves interoperating is the idea of things that might happen in the background to save everyone some effort. So you publish a paper, you submit a manuscript, you submit a data set somewhere. Associated with that, there's your ORCID. At some point that is published with, say, either a DOI for an article or a DataCite DOI for a data set. If those systems are then interoperable, that data can, say, flow automatically back into an offer to populate someone's ORCID record, for example. And that's the sort of workflow which benefits everyone and saves time.
Thank you, Simeon. One thing as well, I know, Simeon, you had mentioned in your, well, I had actually mentioned on behalf of you in the opening bio. I know that there is another project that you're involved in known as OCCFL. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more, especially given current conversations around like why that's relevant, why that's necessary, how that applies to this broader aim of open access and exchange of knowledge.
Yes, I'd be happy to talk about that. Do cut me off if I go too long. OCCFL stands for the Oxford Common File Layout, and it comes out of a realization that repository systems weren't necessarily following sustainable ways for storage of underlying data in ways that support preservation. And I think it's very important that we have an eye to preservation in the repositories we create, whether they're for preservation as their primary purpose or for other reasons. And one of the ideas is that we want to have ways of arranging our files and contents in the underlying system that can outlive the particular technology of implementation. You know, someone writes a piece of code for a repository system, maybe that lasts 10 years, maybe that lasts 20 years if you're really, really, really lucky. Also, we're in a time of great change for storage infrastructures. The market for cloud storage of tape systems, disk systems, and what have you is evolving very rapidly. Whereas we don't want to have to be migrating the fundamental arrangement of our files very frequently. So the ideas of OCCFL were to come up with arrangements that help provide a fabric for portability in this environment.
Thank you, Simeon. I know we have some questions from the chat, but just for our panelists, looking at our last 15 minutes here, to kind of build in a question from the chat with also something I'd love to get your perspectives on more broadly. I know there have been questions around, in terms of discoverability, how do we ensure that research is not static, but can be reused or reproduced, and how infrastructure can support reproducibility. I'm going to tack on one additional element there, because again, we are here in Open Access Week about the relationship of infrastructure, not only to support reproducibility, but also, you know, open access and open science. And would love your thoughts. Anyone? Simeon, over
Perhaps
to you.
I can jump in again. So I think one of the foundations is the open access to the data and the articles at the base level. One of the challenges, of course, in any system is sustainability. So I think here we end up with a very interesting tension between building systems that are all bells and whistles, expandable in every direction, and yet sustainable. So I think one of the things I think about is how do we produce infrastructures that support at reasonable expense the maintenance and preservation of access to data while allowing the evolution of all the exciting things that can happen. And I think that's partly about drawing boundaries, understanding functions, the limits of functionalities, and how we build systems by connecting them interoperably rather than bundling everything into the one impossible to maintain system.
That's a great point. And that ties a bit to what Tom had said before, speaking more about the modular way of building some of these systems, which I think we are starting to see some of where those tensions are manifesting, especially as we're looking at budget constraints and other resource limitations. Anna, chime in.
Yeah, I agree with Simon. And as I mentioned before, the generally understood openness is an important element of modern science, because openness saves time, effort, and financial resources, and it also allows avoiding excluding those who cannot afford to create their own infrastructure. And part of the research is, for example, also the analysis of big data and the performance of complex calculations. Data must also be stored under certain conditions and for a certain period of time. And I think that is why it is such an important issue that that is gaining in importance. The open infrastructure, the shared infrastructure, and the openness itself.
One of the areas that we've been looking at Stanford, both institutionally, but also within the libraries over the last 2-3 years now, is artificial intelligence, machine learning, and data science. And I actually think this is going to really change the way people think about their data in ways that some individual disciplines have done, but hasn't been perhaps as wholesale as we might like to see, because we really are seeing lots of opportunities to repurpose data that's been captured and well enough understood that it can be reused. Ultimately, a lot of the barriers that we see is not around the size of the data or the structure of the file layout for reuse. It's not really around the compute, because it seems like there's always money to find novel ways to build computing infrastructures and get data to it to do shiny blinking things. But it's some of the soft skills, like or other barriers like description or data usage agreements, or just awareness that the other research exists. And I think through data science, where I was talking to a couple of researchers yesterday, and said that the issue isn't that people want to reuse whole data sets, is they want to use extracts. Like if you're doing novel things and you're trying to repurpose it, it's trying to take some of what's already there with some of something else that's already there and create something novel. And I think we'll see whole disciplines and whole new generations of researchers and scientists who are really trained in this methodology and this mindset, and it's going to change the way they go about, and we collectively go about taking care of our data, curating our data, and making sure that it can be used not just for this one grant or this one project, but for a whole program, and maybe even people you don't know.
Thank you. Now, Anna, you had mentioned in terms of your statement about, avoiding excluding others who can't afford to participate. Tom, you just mentioned that, there's always money for compute resources, but, what about for the soft skills? Also, knowing that we are facing very, very different constraints to how this work is, funded and resourced and staffed. I know we have just a few minutes left in this session, but I think we would be remiss if we did not talk about the cost of open, knowing that open isn't free. And that also there have been some big shifts in how we start thinking about supporting this infrastructure to ensure, research continuity and the exchange of ideas. Would love this group's perspective on, what risks do you see in the way in which we support infrastructure projects? And, where are the gaps in funding and resourcing? Where are those manifesting in your own work? And also where have you seen sources of inspiration or hope for ways in which we can amend this moving forward?
So keep it short. Yeah, I think there are some differences between regions and countries in terms of the acceptability of costs, be it infrastructure or other open tools and solutions. And for example, comparing the financial wealth of scientists in Western Europe or the US with the scientists in Central or Eastern Europe, we see that what is achievable for some, for others, exceeds possibilities. And yeah, when we are speaking about the current Open Access Week theme, it comes to the equality, and I think equality in access to knowledge has always been one of the pillars of open science, and less wealthy countries or universities with more modest budgets all the time face financial difficulties, both in terms of access to sources of knowledge, as well as equipment and resources allowing for high-level research. So those resources and tools that can be open should be kept open, and sharing responsibility and costs is a win-win solution for all parties. That is what I think.
Thank you, Anna. Simeon or Tom?
Tom's looking at me. Yeah, I think I'd like to follow on from Anna's comments. I think, as I think about, what does it mean to build a community around a new project and to think about governance, the starting point is, as much as possible, everything you do should be in the open. So someone who's not part of your community potentially still has the ability to reuse whatever you're doing in a way that's useful and matches their needs. But then I think there's the gradation of participation in a community from those who might be able to use it to those who might be able to use it and potentially support it. And I think one of the really hard challenges in our space is to think about how you motivate support that's sufficient for sustaining an initiative with enabling an even broader participation from those who can't. I wish I had a nice succinct answer to that, but I think, that's a key challenge. As often, the human challenges are so much more difficult than the technological challenges.
Yeah, and that notion of the reciprocity, I know, is something that exists not only within institutional context, but also in broader open source software support communities and, in industry, and other sorts of computational spaces as well. Tom?
Anna much earlier on said a key phrase, which was around pooling resources to make possible what a single institution or a single department or a single person couldn't do. And I really think, combined with Simeon's point about ORCID, started off and it needed investment, but is now self-sustaining, is the way we're going to see this move in the future. Kind of generosity of spirit and charity is not the way to really ensure open access, because people change and motivations change, and well-constructed services that provide value and have open services, open access content, open data, open source software are really the way to, I think we're going to see things developing. One of the really exciting things about information, though, is a relatively small team of people can have a tremendous influence, right? A small team of software developers or a single curator can do things that affect people across the world. So we don't need, CERN size supercomputers or colliders, things that they have in CERN. I'm not a physicist, and it shows. And you can have relatively modest budgets and relatively modest sized teams can get things done. But I think a key element is to make sure that there's upfront investment and really kind of professionally, almost to a degree, commercially designed structures that are in place for these organizations to be economically viable and continue making an impact. And there's some really good examples that we've seen come out in the last 5-10 years. And a lot of the funders, I think, are very keyed in on this. So to me, there's a lot of promise, but it's all about the economic model ultimately.
Tom, do you want to name any of those examples that you've seen come out in the last 5 years?
Well, I think ORCID has been, sorry, it's come up, so that one's top of mind. I think some of the others in the United States archive space is one that was developed from the very beginning, as there's a couple of small open source projects which aren't sustainable. It's the same community, but different platforms. The Mellon Foundation in the United States was like, we want a full business model before we get a product spec. And because they weren't worried about the product specs, they were worried about the business model. That's turned out to be tremendously successful. And they have hundreds of institutions, each paying a relatively modest amount. And it's a thriving community success. So I think there are lots of others. In some ways, I envy Anna, because I think Europe is ahead of America on this front. There's the organization and the funding model supports this in a way that America is still a little bit kind of cowboy, not in not a good sense.
Oh, thank you for that. I think lots of food for thought for those that are tuning in, especially as we continue the rest of the events for this week. I know we are almost at the top of the hour, so I will kind of move to wrapping up. Also, just a reminder for those that are tuning in and for those who might be tuning in afterwards, please keep an eye out for other events for Open Access Week. Our huge thanks to EBSCO for setting us up to have this robust conversation, and my thanks also and especially to our panel of speakers here today. Anna, Simeon, and Tom, it's been great to turn over these topics with you and to not only get your perspectives, but to also dig into a little bit more about what this looks like from a practical practitioner-based perspective as well. With that, we will be concluding, and we will hopefully be able to continue this conversation in many other different fora. Thank you again all for tuning in, and we look forward to following up in the weeks to come. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.